After 37 years of examining corporate fraud at the SEC, I found the production files on my son's computer labelled Eleanor Raw Footage P4. My hands trembled as the screen filled with images of me in my most vulnerable moments. Crying at my husband's memorial plaque, struggling with my new medication, confiding fears I'd only shared in what I thought was privacy. The timestamps showed Michael had been recording me for over a year. Thousands of hours of footage prepared for a documentary series I never consented to. What he could never have anticipated was that the skills I'd used to unravel complex financial frauds for decades were perfectly suited for what I was about to do next. I suppose I should start at the beginning. The morning light in Pennsylvania has a particular quality in autumn, soft yet precise, illuminating the edges of things with a clarity that feels almost like truth. I have always been an early riser, a habit from decades at the Securities and Exchange Commission, where I often arrived before dawn to review case files in the quiet hours. Even now, at 72, I'm awake by 5, measuring coffee beans into the grinder my husband Richard gave me for our 20th anniversary, 2 years before the heart attack that took him. Our home, my home now, sits on a quiet street in a suburb of Philadelphia. 4 bedrooms, one for us, one for Michael. One I converted to a home office after Richard died, and one that became a guest room after Michael left for Princeton. I've maintained it meticulously for 43 years, the same way I maintained everything else: my career, my family, my dignity, after becoming a widow at 41 with a 14-year-old son to raise alone. When Richard died, I was mid-career at the SEC, just beginning to receive the complex cases that would eventually define my professional legacy. I could have stepped back, taken a less demanding position. Many suggested I should. Instead, I rose at 4, prepared Michael's lunch, left notes in his backpack, worked 10-hour days investigating financial fraud, then came home to help with calculus homework and attend parent-teacher conferences alone. Weekends I spent at Michael's baseball games, sitting in the bleachers with case files balanced on my lap during quieter innings. Vacations were strategically planned around court dates. When Michael decided on Princeton, his father's alma mater, I took on consulting work during my off hours to ensure he graduated without a single student loan, something I never mentioned until years later when he casually referenced friends still paying off their education. "You never had student debt," I said quietly over dinner. "What?" "I thought I had some small loans," he replied with genuine confusion. "No," I said. "I worked weekends for Belmonte Associates, forensic accounting for their private clients." "Why didn't you ever tell me?" he asked. I remember shrugging, passing him the green beans I'd grown in the garden. "You had enough to worry about. Your focus needed to be on your studies." This was my way: quiet competence. Problems solved before they became problems. Sacrifices made without announcement. It never occurred to me to do otherwise. The first time I noticed something had changed between us was at Michael's company launch party 5 years ago. I'd been retired for only a year, adjusting to days without the structure of investigations and evidence reviews. He'd invited me as a courtesy, his newly wealthy tech entrepreneur son, acknowledging his middle-class mother's existence. I wore a navy dress I'd purchased specifically for the occasion. Pearls Richard had given me on our 10th anniversary, sensible heels that wouldn't leave my feet aching. The venue was sleek, all glass and polished concrete. Michael spotted me across the room, waved, approached with a woman I didn't recognize trailing behind him. "Mum, you made it," he said, kissing my cheek. "This is Vanessa. Vanessa, my mother. Not this is my mother, Eleanor, or this is Eleanor Wells. Just my mother, as though I had no identity beyond my relationship to him." "So lovely to meet you," Vanessa said, eyes assessing me with the quick calculation of someone determining value. "Michael's told me so much about you." "Has he?" I replied with a smile, knowing precisely how little that likely was. A waiter passed with champagne. Michael took 2 glasses, handed one to Vanessa, failed to notice I stood empty-handed. I didn't reach for one myself, observing the small exclusion with the detached interest I once applied to suspicious transaction patterns. "So you were a bookkeeper, right?" Vanessa asked, her smile fixed. "I was a forensic accountant for the Securities and Exchange Commission," I replied. "I specialized in fraud investigation." "Oh, like taxes and things," she nodded, already looking past me to more important guests. "More like the Westbrook Securities case," I said. "We uncovered an $850 million fraud that would have collapsed 14 pension funds. It was my most significant achievement, the case that had earned me a commendation from the Treasury Secretary." Michael laughed, his hand on my shoulder. "Mum was very dedicated to her government job," he explained to Vanessa as though translating a foreign language. "Very detail-oriented." "I prevented thousands of retirees from losing everything," I said quietly. "It took 3 years of investigation." "So impressive," Vanessa murmured without interest. "Michael, isn't that Senator Whitman over there?" They excused themselves moments later. I watched my son guide his girlfriend through the crowd, his hand at the small of her back, both of them gleaming with the particular sheen of the newly prosperous. I stood alone for 27 minutes, calculating the optimal moment to leave without appearing rude or hurting Michael's feelings. As I gathered my coat, Michael intercepted me near the door. "Leaving already, Mum?" "It's been lovely," I said. "Congratulations on your success." He hugged me, genuine affection in the gesture. "Thanks for coming. Are you sure you're okay to drive? It's pretty late for you." I checked my watch. It was 8:45 p.m. I had once led a 72-hour investigation that resulted in arrests across 3 states. "I'll manage," I said. "Text me when you get home," he instructed, as though I were a teenager returning from a party rather than a woman who had raised him alone while building a career that had helped shape financial regulation. "Of course," I replied, because it was easier than explaining. In the months that followed, similar interactions accumulated like entries in a ledger. Small dismissals, gentle corrections, conversations where my experiences were translated into simplified versions of themselves. When Michael married Vanessa 3 years ago, I was seated at a table with distant cousins rather than at the family table. When I mentioned it, Michael seemed genuinely confused. "We thought you'd be more comfortable with people your own age, Mom." The cousins were in their 50s. I had friends in their 30s. At family gatherings, I noticed how conversations shifted when I joined them. Complex topics simplified, political discussions muted, as though my presence required intellectual dilution. If I mentioned my ongoing volunteer work helping low-income seniors with tax preparation, Michael would smile indulgently. "Mom just can't stay retired," he'd tell others, as though my continued engagement with my professional skills was a cute quirk rather than the ongoing application of expertise. When I visited their new home, a modernist structure of glass and stone that Michael called minimalist and I silently considered sterile, Vanessa gave me a tour that included careful instructions on using the shower controls. "The temperature can be tricky," she explained slowly, demonstrating the simple lever as though I might find it puzzling. I, who had mastered every technological transition from carbon paper to cloud storage, who had tracked digital fund transfers across 17 countries in the Belgrade Mutual Fund case. I said nothing, noting the interaction as another data point in an emerging pattern. The first concrete evidence that something beyond casual disregard was occurring came during a Sunday dinner at their home last November. I'd arrived early at Michael's request, something about wanting my input on a family photo arrangement. When I entered through the unlocked door, calling out my arrival, no one answered. I found myself alone in their vast, open-plan living area. On the dining table, partially covered by a magazine, sat a document titled Silver Truths Series Overview. Curious, I glanced at it, expecting some investment prospectus related to Michael's business. Instead, I saw my name in the opening paragraph. Eleanor Wells represents a vanishing generation, children of post-war prosperity who navigated unprecedented social change while holding to traditional values now considered outdated. My stomach tightened as I continued reading. This documentary series will provide an intimate, unflinching portrait of aging in America through one remarkable woman's journey. I heard footsteps and quickly replaced the document, moving to examine the photographs on the wall as Michael entered. "Mum, you're early," he said, kissing my cheek. "The traffic was lighter than expected," I replied, my voice steady despite the unease settling in my chest. Throughout dinner, I observed them with new awareness. The way Michael directed conversation toward my past, my childhood during the Kennedy era, my early marriage, my experiences as one of few female professionals in financial investigation. Vanessa's careful follow-up questions about how it felt to experience various historical moments. When Michael asked about Richard's death, a topic he knew was still painful 30 years later, I noticed Vanessa's hand slip beneath the table, returning with what appeared to be a small remote. The subtle adjustment of a camera angle from the decorative shelf? I couldn't be certain. "It's still difficult to discuss," I said, watching them closely. "But don't you think sharing could help others going through similar losses?" Vanessa pressed, an intensity in her expression that hadn't been there moments before. "Perhaps," I conceded, offering no further details. I left earlier than planned, citing fatigue. As Michael walked me to my car, I casually asked, "What exactly does your company produce these days? I know you started in home security, but you mentioned expanding." "Oh, lots of things," he said vaguely. "Technology solutions, content platforms, the usual startup evolution. Nothing that would interest you, Mum." I nodded, accepting his kiss on my cheek, and drove home in contemplative silence. At 72, I'd conducted enough investigations to recognize evasion. Whatever was happening, my son didn't want me to know the full scope of it. Over the following months, I observed with increasing clarity the convenient placement of phones during emotional conversations, Vanessa's pointed questions about my generational experiences, Michael's casual suggestions that I tell specific stories from my past, just like you told me as a kid. The most unsettling incident occurred during their Christmas gathering. I overheard Michael in his home office, door slightly ajar. "We need more authentic reaction footage. The material from Thanksgiving was too staged. You can see her noticing the camera." A pause, presumably listening to someone on the phone. "No, she doesn't suspect anything. Mum's completely tech-averse. She still writes checks for bills." This last comment almost made me smile despite my growing concern. I'd helped design digital fraud detection protocols for the SEC in the 1990s and had kept pace with technology throughout my career. My preference for paper records was about creating tangible evidence trails, not technological ineptitude. But I'd never corrected Michael's assumption, a habit from my professional life where being underestimated often proved advantageous during investigations. I moved away from the door before he emerged, my mind working through possibilities with the methodical precision that had once been my professional hallmark. Something was happening, something involving recording me without consent. But to what end? And how extensive was it? I began watching more carefully, noticing the slight repositioning of decorative objects in my own home after their visits, the casual gifts of digital picture frames and smart speakers that Michael insisted on setting up himself, the increasingly frequent invitations to their home for casual dinners that always seemed to involve prompts for me to discuss emotionally charged topics. If you found yourself in a similar situation, watching as someone you love transforms you from person to project, you understand that nauseating moment of clarity when suspicion solidifies into certainty. For me, that moment came when I found a wireless microphone taped beneath my dining table after hosting Michael and Vanessa for my birthday dinner. Small, black, professional grade. Not something that could be explained away as a misunderstanding or oversight. I held it in my palm, this tangible evidence of betrayal, and felt something shift within me, the mental click of pieces falling into place. I didn't confront them immediately. That's not how successful investigations work. You gather evidence, establish patterns, understand motives. You wait for the complete picture to emerge. If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from, but what I didn't realize then was why they had suddenly become so insistent that I stay in their home while they took their Mediterranean cruise. The mansion wasn't just a generous offer, it was a staged environment, and I was about to become the unwitting star of their production. I agreed to house sit after their third request. Michael had never been so persistent about anything involving me in years. He framed it as a favor to them. The security system really needs a human presence, and a treat for me. You deserve a luxury vacation, Mum. When I suggested hiring a professional house sitter, his reaction was disproportionately negative. I wouldn't trust a stranger in our home, he insisted, though I knew they employed a rotating staff of housekeepers and gardeners they barely knew. I relented partly out of curiosity. After 37 years investigating fraud, I recognized when someone was selling too hard. Whatever was happening in that house, I wanted to understand it. They left on a Tuesday morning, Michael kissing my cheek as Vanessa waited in the car. "Make yourself completely at home," he said, squeezing my shoulder. "Use anything you want. The house is yours until we get back." I watched their car disappear down the long driveway, then turned to the silent house with its soaring ceilings and cold surfaces. 14,000 square feet of modernist architecture, filled with technology disguised as furniture and decorative objects. I gave them 3 hours, time enough to board their flight to Rome, before I began my systematic exploration. I started with the obvious: security cameras in the entryways, living areas, kitchen. Those they'd openly discussed, framing them as standard home protection. More concerning were the ones partially concealed in bedroom light fixtures, bathroom vents, the decorative moulding in the guest suite where I was staying. I noted each location without disabling any. Evidence gathering requires patience. On the second day, I went to Michael's home office, ostensibly to check the weather forecast on his desktop computer. I could have used my phone, of course, but I needed a plausible reason to access his primary workstation. The password was easy enough to guess: Vanessa's birthday followed by the year of their marriage. My son always did favor sentiment over security. What I found shattered any lingering hope that I'd misinterpreted the situation. The production folder was right there on the desktop, not even hidden in subdirectories. Silver Truths, the Eleanor Wells story. I clicked it open, my hands steady despite the roaring in my ears. Hundreds of video files meticulously organized. Eleanor griefed sorrow1.mp4. Footage of me at Richard's memorial plaque on the anniversary of his death. Eleanor frustration shopping mp4. Me struggling with self-checkout at the grocery store after someone had moved my reading glasses. Eleanor confused smartphone mp4. My reaction when Michael had updated my phone, erasing my carefully organized system. A spreadsheet titled Emotional Catalogue contained timestamps and descriptions. Excellent vulnerability moment at 13:42. Usable reaction to technology failure at 00817. Powerful widow reflection. Potential series highlight. My life, my private griefs and frustrations, reduced to content categories and production notes. I opened a document labelled Series Treatment and read, Silver Truths, the Eleanor Wells story presents an unfiltered look at America's invisible generation. Through intimate access to Eleanor's daily life, viewers witness the dignity and struggles of aging in a youth-obsessed culture. By capturing authentic moments rather than rehearsed interviews, this groundbreaking series reveals truths that subjects themselves might never articulate. Another file labelled Mediterranean Opportunity outlined their plans for my 3-week stay. Home monitoring provides unprecedented opportunity for unguarded footage in controlled environment. Subject will be alone and therefore more likely to display authentic behaviours without self-consciousness. Remote interventions planned, see schedule, to elicit specific reactions for narrative requirements. The schedule detailed planned disruptions to the smart home system, temperature fluctuations in my bedroom, brief power outages, security system false alarms, all designed to capture my frustration and confusion. They had even placed certain photographs strategically, including several of Richard, to prompt emotional reflection moments. I sat in Michael's ergonomic chair, the screen's blue light illuminating my face, and felt a cold clarity settle over me. The betrayal was total. My son and his wife weren't just recording me. They were manipulating my environment, manufacturing scenarios designed to exploit my vulnerabilities, all to produce content for public consumption. For precisely 4 minutes, I allowed myself to feel the full force of it. The violation, the humiliation, the profound breach of trust. My hands trembled once, then steadied. I took 3 deep, measured breaths, the technique I'd used before testifying in high-pressure fraud cases. Then I began to think like an investigator again. The initial discovery was merely the surface. Methodical examination revealed 3 distinct layers of betrayal, each more damaging than the last. The first layer was the dignity violations, how they spoke about me when I wasn't meant to hear. In production notes and emails, I found my son's assessments of his own mother. Eleanor represents the perfect subject, intellectually sharp enough to articulate experiences, but traditional enough to embody generational contradictions. Her resistance to technology creates natural tension points for narrative development. In one email to their production partner, Vanessa wrote, "She has no idea she's being recorded, which gives us completely authentic reactions." The combination of her articulate communication and her unawareness of being observed is documentary gold. They discussed me as though I were a character rather than a person, debating which of my traits to emphasize for maximum audience engagement. My grief for Richard was described as compelling widow content. My professional accomplishments were minimized as background context rather than primary narrative focus. Most painful was finding Michael's response when asked about consent issues. My mother would never understand the significance of this project. Securing formal consent would fundamentally change her behavior on camera and compromise the authenticity that makes this concept valuable. We're telling her story with respect. Sometimes, the subject isn't the best judge of how their experience should be shared. The second layer was the manipulation, the carefully engineered scenarios designed to capture specific reactions. Beyond passive recording, they had deliberately created situations to provoke emotional responses. The time Vanessa had accidentally shown me photos of Richard's college days wasn't accidental at all. Michael's pointed questions about whether I felt invisible as I aged weren't genuine concern, but content gathering. I found a document titled Reaction Catalysts that outlined techniques, positioning technology to frustrate me, raising topics that might trigger emotional memories, even manipulating physical environments to create confusion. They had installed special fixtures in my guest bathroom that could be remotely controlled to change water temperature suddenly, scheduled for day 7 of my stay to capture authentic frustration in private space. The third and most devastating layer was the identity erasure, the complete rewriting of who I was to fit their narrative needs. The documentary presented me not as Eleanor Wells, dedicated professional who had helped shape financial regulation and raised a successful son single-handedly, but as Eleanor, a generic elderly woman whose primary value lay in representing demographic trends. A creative brief stated, while Eleanor's specific career in government finance isn't particularly cinematic, it provides context for her traditional values and structured approach to life. 37 years investigating complex financial crimes, testifying before Congress, preventing thousands of retirees from losing their life savings, reduced to government finance that wasn't particularly cinematic. My expertise, the intellectual rigor that had defined my professional life, was deliberately minimized to foreground what they called my more universally relatable struggles with technology and isolation. They were erasing the very aspects of my identity I valued most, replacing them with a constructed persona that better served their narrative requirements. I discovered all this methodically over hours, saving copies of key files to my secure cloud storage, documenting file paths and timestamps with the same precision I once applied to fraud investigations. Throughout, I maintained perfect external composure, aware of the cameras recording my every move. If they reviewed the footage later, they would see only an elderly mother using her son's computer, occasionally making notes in the small leather notebook I always carried, a habit from my professional days that Michael found amusingly outdated, but that now served a crucial purpose. Inside, I felt a cold rage building. Not the hot, destructive anger that leads to poor decisions, but the clarifying fury that had helped me break open the Westbrook Securities case when others were ready to abandon it. This was the anger that sharpened focus rather than clouding it. The precise moment everything changed came at 2:17 a.m. on the fourth night of my stay. I had continued my normal routine, giving no indication I'd discovered their scheme. I'd even responded appropriately to their first remote intervention, a carefully timed thermostat manipulation that left my bedroom uncomfortably cold at 3 a.m. I'd simply added another blanket and made a confused comment about the temperature that their microphones would surely capture. That night, I sat on the edge of the vast guest bed, surrounded by luxury that suddenly felt like a stage set. On the nightstand stood a framed photo of Richard that hadn't been there when I arrived, strategically placed by Vanessa, according to the production schedule, to prompt nighttime reflection on widowhood. I picked up the photograph, this prop in their production. Richard smiled back at me, 38 years old forever, his arm around 29-year-old me at Rehoboth Beach. We'd driven down for the weekend, leaving 4-year-old Michael with my mother. I remembered the wind, the particular quality of East Coast light in early summer, the feel of Richard's cotton shirt against my cheek when he hugged me. That moment belonged to us, not to Michael's documentary, not to viewers seeking authentic emotion from a stranger's most private griefs. I placed the photograph face down on the nightstand and stood, straightening my spine in a single deliberate movement. I caught my reflection in the bedroom mirror. A woman of 72, silver hair cut in a practical bob, the same clear grey eyes that had stared down white-collar criminals and corrupt executives. Enough, I said aloud, knowing the hidden microphones would capture it. Not caring. I had spent decades building cases methodically, gathering evidence others missed, constructing airtight prosecutions that led to justice. These skills hadn't disappeared with retirement. They had merely lain dormant, waiting for a reason to reawaken. Michael and Vanessa had made a fundamental miscalculation. In their determination to capture the authentic experience of aging, they had forgotten that this particular aging woman had spent her professional life identifying, documenting, and prosecuting sophisticated fraud. They saw a generic elderly mother. They should have remembered the forensic accountant who had never lost a case. My approach to complex financial fraud cases always began with the same question. What does the perpetrator value most? In Michael and Vanessa's case, the answer was obvious: their carefully curated public image and the success of their documentary series. I began my counter-strategy with 3 clear objectives. 1. Document the full extent of their surveillance and manipulation. 2. Secure irrefutable evidence of consent violations and privacy infringement. 3. Position myself to control the narrative resolution. First, I created a comprehensive record of the surveillance infrastructure throughout the house. Using my phone's camera, I photographed every hidden recording device I could locate, documenting their positions and angles. I matched these against the house blueprints I found in Michael's files, creating a complete surveillance map. I located the primary server where footage was being stored. A sophisticated setup in what appeared to be a wine cellar, but actually housed their technology infrastructure. Access required Michael's fingerprint, or a passcode. The passcode, like his computer password, was easily deduced. Vanessa's birth year, followed by their wedding date. Inside the server room, I found everything: complete raw footage archives, automated data backups, cloud storage access points. I didn't disturb anything, just documented thoroughly, taking careful notes on file structures and access protocols. Next, I located and reviewed the legal documentation for the project. As I suspected, there were release forms prepared for me to sign after the fact, once the footage had already been captured. Notes in the production documents referenced securing subject consent before distribution phase, with strategies for convincing me to sign after footage was already compiled. One particularly revealing email from Michael to their production partner read, "Once she sees how positively she's portrayed, I don't anticipate resistance to formalizing consent. If necessary, we can frame it as a legacy project that will help others, which appeals to her sense of duty." My son, it seemed, understood me just well enough to manipulate me, but not well enough to anticipate how I would respond to that manipulation. For the next 2 weeks, I executed a carefully calibrated plan. During the day, I behaved exactly as expected, following their anticipated patterns, responding to their remote interventions with appropriate confusion or frustration, even talking to Richard's photograph when I knew the cameras were active. At night, between 2 and 4 a.m., when remote monitoring was minimal, according to the schedules I'd found, I worked methodically. I created secure copies of all relevant files, documented every privacy violation, and, most importantly, conducted a detailed financial analysis of the project. This last element proved most illuminating. The documentary wasn't merely a creative endeavour, it was the centerpiece of a major distribution deal with a streaming platform. Michael stood to gain significant financial benefits from exploiting my private life without consent. The contract specified unprecedented access to subjects' unfiltered daily reality as a key deliverable. I also discovered something they had taken great pains to conceal. This wasn't their first such project. 3 previous documentaries had employed similar surveillance techniques with elderly subjects. In 2 cases, the subjects had died before the documentaries were released, neatly avoiding consent issues. In the third, the subject, a former colleague of mine surprisingly, had signed releases after being shown a heavily edited version of the footage that omitted the most intrusive elements. This pattern elevated their actions from personal betrayal to systematic exploitation. Throughout this investigation, I maintained perfect external composure. I knew every moment was potentially being recorded, so I calibrated every visible reaction. I allowed them to capture exactly what they expected. An elderly mother enjoying a luxury home, occasionally confused by technology, sometimes emotional when confronting reminders of her late husband. What they didn't capture was Eleanor Wells, forensic investigator, methodically building a case each night while they believed she was sleeping. I had one significant advantage: Michael and Vanessa's profound underestimation of me. Their production notes repeatedly referenced my technological limitations and predictable routines, assumptions that now worked in my favor. They never imagined I could access their encrypted files or understand the sophisticated surveillance architecture they'd constructed. The most challenging moment came when I accidentally triggered an alert by accessing certain restricted files. I watched the security system register the unauthorized access, knowing it might notify Michael immediately. Instead of panicking, I deliberately spilled tea on my nightgown, setting off activity in front of the bedroom camera, as though I'd awakened for this mundane reason. The distraction worked. A notification in the system acknowledged subject nighttime activity, bathroom usage, and the security alert was overridden. By the beginning of the 3rd week, I had compiled comprehensive documentation of every aspect of their operation. I had secured copies of all relevant files on encrypted drives that only I could access. I had constructed a detailed timeline of their surveillance escalation. Most importantly, I had identified the precise leverage points that would be most effective when the time came for confrontation. The final element of my strategy involved careful preparation for their return. I created a detailed agenda for our conversation, anticipating every possible response they might offer. I selected the optimal location in their home for this discussion, the living room with its multiple cameras, ensuring that their reactions would be captured by their own surveillance system, creating a perfect symmetry to the betrayal. As I prepared for their return, I felt a strange calm settle over me. This clarity of purpose, gathering evidence, building a case, preparing for resolution, was so familiar from my professional life that it almost felt like returning home after a long absence. What Michael and Vanessa never understood was that with every dismissive comment about my technological abilities, every assumption about my conventional thinking, they were giving me exactly what I needed: the power of being underestimated. They saw a generic elderly mother defined by age and presumed limitations. They forgot entirely about the forensic investigator who had specialized in identifying subtle patterns that others missed. The woman who had testified before Congress multiple times, who had helped draft regulatory frameworks that governed financial systems. While they believed age had weakened me, it had actually given me patience and perspective they couldn't comprehend. I had quietly collected my evidence: their production files, the surveillance architecture documentation, the financial contracts specifying unaware subject recording, the pattern of exploitation across multiple elderly individuals. I had chosen the perfect moment for everything to come to light, when the very cameras they installed to exploit me would record their own exposure. But what they never expected was that I had copied their entire raw footage archive, over 300 hours of unauthorized recordings, and had already sent selected segments to Sandra Chen, my former colleague who now specialized in elder law and digital privacy violations. My insurance policy, set to activate if anything happened to prevent me from completing my plan. They returned on a Sunday afternoon, tanned and relaxed from 3 weeks in the Mediterranean sun. I greeted them in the kitchen where I'd prepared a welcome home meal: Richard's lasagna recipe that Michael had always loved as a child. "Mom, you didn't have to cook," Michael said, kissing my cheek. "We could have ordered something." "I wanted to," I replied. "We should sit down together after you've had time to settle in. There's something important we need to discuss." A flicker of concern crossed his face, quickly suppressed but visible to someone who had spent decades reading subtle reactions during depositions. "Everything okay?" he asked casually, already reaching for his phone to check the surveillance logs, though he tried to disguise the movement as merely checking messages. "Everything is precisely as it should be," I said, my voice measured. "Dinner will be ready at 6. They retreated to their bedroom to unpack, and I moved with calm precision through final preparations. I set the dining room table with their expensive china, arranged flowers in the centerpiece, opened a bottle of Cabernet to breathe, the picture of a dutiful mother welcoming her son home. What they couldn't see were the small adjustments I had made to their surveillance system, the carefully prepared materials waiting on my encrypted tablet, the strategic text I'd sent to Sandra Chen confirming their arrival. At precisely 6 o'clock, we sat down to dinner. I served the lasagna that had once represented family and trust, but now served a different purpose: establishing a familiar setting that would make what followed even more powerful by contrast. "How was the cruise?" I asked, passing the salad. "Amazing," Vanessa enthused. "The Amalfi Coast was just stunning. We have pictures to show you." She launched into details about excursions and meals, precisely the surface-level conversation I had anticipated. I let them talk, noting how frequently they checked their phones, no doubt reviewing surveillance data from while they were gone, confirming that their footage had been captured as planned. When dinner was nearly complete, I placed my napkin beside my plate and looked directly at Michael. "I'd like to discuss your documentary project now," I said quietly. "The one where I'm the unwitting subject." The transformation in their expressions was immediate and complete. Michael froze mid-reach for his wineglass. Vanessa's practiced smile vanished. "What are you talking about, Mum?" Michael attempted, his voice slightly higher than normal. I reached for my tablet and opened the folder labeled Silver Truths Evidence. I'm talking about the extensive surveillance system you've installed to record me without consent. I'm referring to the production files on your server detailing plans to manipulate my environment to elicit specific emotional responses. I'm discussing the considerable financial arrangement with Horizon Streaming that depends on delivering, and I quote, unprecedented access to subjects' unfiltered daily reality. I turned the tablet towards them, displaying their own production schedule. Perhaps most importantly, I'm addressing the fundamental betrayal of using your mother's private grief and personal moments as content for public consumption without permission. The silence that followed was absolute. In 37 years of fraud investigations, I had witnessed many moments of realization. That instant when perpetrators understand their schemes have been exposed. This was among the most profound. How did you, Michael began, then stopped, recalibrating. Mum, this isn't what it looks like. We're creating something meaningful, something that honors your generation's experiences. By secretly recording me in my bedroom? I asked, my voice steady. By planning temperature fluctuations to capture my confusion? By strategically placing photos of my dead husband to trigger grief responses on camera? I slid a printed document across the table. Their reaction catalysts plan, with my own detailed annotations beside each manipulation strategy. Your surveillance began over a year ago, I continued. First in my home during your visits, then escalating to permanent installations disguised as gifts. The digital picture frame in my living room, the smart speaker in my kitchen, each containing hidden cameras and microphones. Vanessa attempted to take control of the narrative. Eleanor, we understand this must be upsetting, but this project comes from a place of deep respect. Your experiences are valuable and should be shared. Then you should have asked permission, I replied simply. Instead, you chose exploitation disguised as appreciation. I opened another file on my tablet, a comprehensive map of every recording device in both their home and mine, with timestamps of installation and activation. This level of surveillance without consent isn't just a betrayal, I said. It's potentially illegal in Pennsylvania under wiretapping statutes and digital privacy laws. Michael paled. Legal consequences clearly hadn't entered his calculations. Mum, can we discuss this reasonably? His tone shifted to the condescending patience I'd grown familiar with, the voice he used when explaining why I shouldn't worry about certain decisions. The documentary world operates differently from what you're used to. There's an artistic... I've reviewed your contracts with Horizon, I interrupted. Specifically Section 11.3 regarding subject consent requirements. Your delivery deadline is in 6 weeks, but you cannot legally submit this footage without documented consent from the primary subject, me. The shift in the room was palpable. This wasn't proceeding according to any script they had prepared for dealing with upset elderly relatives. This was a methodical dismantling of their project by someone who understood both the evidence and its implications. What exactly do you want? Michael asked finally, dropping all pretense. 3 things, I replied, placing my folded hands on the table. First, complete removal of all surveillance equipment from my home by tomorrow afternoon. Second, permanent deletion of all footage featuring me, verified by an independent technical expert of my choosing. Third, a legally binding agreement never to record me again without explicit written consent. That would effectively kill the project, Vanessa said, anger finally breaking through her polished exterior. Do you have any idea how much we've invested in this? $4.2 million in production costs to date, with an anticipated return of $18.7 million based on your distribution agreement, I answered calmly. I reviewed your financial projections quite thoroughly. Michael stared at me as though seeing me for the first time in years. Perhaps because he was. How did you access all this? These files were encrypted. I was conducting complex financial investigations when you were learning multiplication tables, Michael, I replied, allowing a hint of professional pride to colour my voice. Your security protocols were adequate for general purposes, but not designed to withstand scrutiny from someone with my specific background. I saw the moment he truly understood. Not just that his project was compromised, but that he had fundamentally misjudged the woman who had raised him. He had been so fixated on capturing the elderly mother, he thought he knew that he had completely forgotten the forensic investigator who had once testified before Congress. "If we refuse?" Vanessa asked, her tone somewhere between defiance and fear. In answer, I pressed a single button on my phone. Their television activated automatically, displaying selected footage from their own recordings. Michael instructing camera placement in my bathroom. Vanessa discussing how to provoke emotional responses. Both of them reviewing raw footage of me crying at Richard's memorial plaque, with Michael commenting that it was perfect vulnerability content. "I've prepared a comprehensive file for Sandra Chen at Bergman, Chen, and Associates," I said as they watched themselves in horrified silence. "She specializes in elder rights and digital privacy violations. The file will be automatically released tomorrow unless I personally prevent it." I let them absorb this information before continuing. "I've also documented your previous projects using similar techniques with other elderly subjects, two of whom, I've discovered, were never given the opportunity to consent because they died before distribution. The third, Julian Mercer, was a former colleague of mine who would be very interested to learn how selectively you edited his footage before obtaining his signature." Michael's face had gone completely white. "Mum, please. This would destroy everything we've built. You should have considered that before turning your mother into content," I replied, my voice still calm but allowing the hurt to surface briefly. Before exploiting my grief for Richard to increase viewer engagement, for the first time I saw genuine shame in his expression. "What happens now?" he asked quietly. "Now we implement my terms," I said. "Equipment removal, footage deletion, legal agreement. Once those are complete, we never speak of this again." "And if we agree?" Vanessa asked. "Then your broader projects and professional reputation remain intact. This specific documentary disappears, but your company continues. Consider it a merciful outcome compared to what could happen if this became public." They exchanged glances, a silent calculation visible in their expressions. Finally, Michael nodded. "We'll do it," he said. "All of it." "Good," I replied, standing from the table. "The legal agreement is already prepared. You can review it tonight and sign tomorrow before the equipment removal begins." As I gathered my things to leave, Michael spoke again, his voice smaller than I'd heard it in years. "Mum, I'm sorry. I really thought we were creating something meaningful." I paused at the door, looking back at my son, this person I had raised who had somehow become a stranger capable of such betrayal. "The most meaningful thing we can create, Michael, is trust. Everything else is just content." The equipment removal took place the following day under my direct supervision. A team of technicians, not Michael's usual contractors, but professionals I had selected from a reputable security firm, systematically removed every camera, microphone, and monitoring device from my home. They found 17 separate surveillance points, including ones I hadn't identified in my initial assessment. Michael and Vanessa signed the legal agreement without further argument. The document, drafted with Sandra Chen's expert guidance, included significant financial penalties for any future violations. It also contained a complete confidentiality clause, protecting both my privacy and, ironically, their professional reputations. The footage deletion was verified by a digital forensics expert who had once consulted for me on SEC cases. He confirmed the permanent removal of all files containing my image or voice from their servers, cloud storage, and backup systems. Throughout this process, I maintained professional composure, treating the situation as the conclusion of a successful investigation rather than a family trauma. This approach seemed to unsettle Michael more than anger would have. He had no framework for understanding this version of his mother, the methodical investigator who had once brought down financial criminals and was now calmly dismantling his exploitation scheme. The most telling consequence wasn't procedural, but relational. In the days that followed, I observed a fundamental recalibration in how they interacted with me. The condescension vanished, replaced by an awkward deference that was almost as inappropriate but at least acknowledged my competence. For weeks afterward, Michael called daily with careful, formal inquiries about my well-being. These conversations were stilted, haunted by the unspoken betrayal between us. Vanessa sent flowers with a handwritten note that managed to be both apologetic and self-justifying, typical of someone who recognized they should feel remorse but didn't fully understand why. The broader consequences extended to their professional lives as well. Without directly violating our agreement, I made certain inquiries that resulted in industry scrutiny of their documentary practices. Not enough to destroy their business, but sufficient to ensure that future projects would include proper consent protocols and ethical oversight. I also contacted Julian Mercer, my former colleague who had been a previous subject, ostensibly to reconnect after many years. Without explicitly mentioning what I knew, I asked enough questions about his documentary experience to make him reconsider the footage that had been used. He subsequently requested a review of his own files and discovered discrepancies that led to further questions about their methods. These ripples spread quietly through their professional world. Not a public scandal, but a subtle accountability that would shape their future work more ethically. The most profound consequence, however, was the permanent transformation of my relationship with my son. The easy trust that should exist between parent and child had been fractured in ways that could never be fully repaired. We would eventually establish a new relationship, more formal and bounded by explicit expectations rather than assumed affection, but the unquestioning closeness was gone forever. This wasn't the outcome I had wanted, but it was the necessary result of choices Michael had made. Sometimes justice comes not through dramatic public exposure, but through the quieter, more devastating accountability of living with the knowledge of what you've done and what it has cost you. The true resolution came not through consequences for Michael and Vanessa, but through my own reclamation of identity and dignity. In the months that followed, I systematically rebuilt my life, on my own terms, with full awareness of my worth and capabilities. I began by renovating my home, removing every trace of the surveillance equipment, and reclaiming each space as truly mine. I painted the living room the deep terracotta I'd always wanted, but had deferred to Michael's preference for neutral tones. I rearranged furniture to optimize for my needs rather than camera angles. I replaced the digital gifts with analog alternatives chosen for personal meaning rather than connectivity. Most significantly, I expanded my volunteer work with low-income seniors, helping them navigate financial systems that often seem designed to exploit their vulnerabilities. This work, using my professional expertise to protect others from the kind of exploitation I had experienced, provided a symmetry that felt like healing. I also reconnected with former colleagues, no longer hiding my ongoing professional interests from Michael out of fear that he would find them unsuitable for a woman of my age. I joined Sandra Chen for occasional consulting work on cases involving financial exploitation of elderly individuals, bringing my unique perspective to this growing field. 3 months after the confrontation, I sold my house of 43 years. Not because Michael had suggested it was too much to manage, but because I wanted a fresh start in a space without surveillance shadows. I purchased a smaller but elegant condominium in Center City, Philadelphia, within walking distance of cultural attractions and the university where I began teaching a course on financial ethics. The new home reflected my actual tastes rather than the conventional preferences Michael had attributed to me. Modern art on the walls. A state-of-the-art kitchen where I experimented with the global cuisines I'd always been curious about, a dedicated office with professional-grade technology that acknowledged my continuing intellectual engagement with the world. My relationship with Michael and Vanessa evolved into something carefully calibrated, regular but brief interactions with clear boundaries. I maintained the connection out of recognition that people are complex and relationships can transform without ending completely. The hurt remained, but I chose not to let it define my remaining years. Perhaps the most profound aspect of reclamation was internal, the quiet celebration of my own competence. The skills that had defined my professional life hadn't vanished with retirement. They had simply awaited the right application. In dismantling Michael's surveillance scheme, I had reaffirmed my identity not just as a mother, but as Eleanor Wells, investigator and strategist, a woman whose mind remained her most powerful asset, regardless of age. 6 months after moving to my new home, I hosted a dinner party for former colleagues and new friends. As we sat around my dining table, no hidden cameras, no manipulated conversations, Sandra raised her glass in a toast. To Eleanor, she said, who reminds us that the most dangerous assumption is underestimating a woman with a lifetime of experience. I smiled, lifting my own glass in acknowledgement. This was the truth I had reclaimed, not the silver truth Michael had hoped to package for viewers, but the authentic reality of a woman who refused to be reduced to content, who insisted on defining her own narrative. The cameras had been meant to make me visible on others' terms. Their removal allowed me to become truly seen on my own. If you haven't subscribed yet, click the button now to join our community of women who refuse to be invisible. You'll find stories like this one every day, stories that remind us all that wisdom and patience can be more powerful than anger when seeking justice. Be sure to check out the video appearing on your screen now for another powerful story of transformation. Thank you for watching. See you in the next video.